If you're looking for more intimacy and depth and connection in your relationship, this is absolutely the episode for you. In today's conversation, I sit down with Kat Smailis, also known as Kat the Intimacy Therapist on Instagram. And we discuss everything from masculine, feminine dynamics to trauma, nervous system regulation, to even going into some deep dives in other areas that you'll find pretty amusing. It's my intention to be as vulnerable as I can on these episodes as well. So I do share some information that I hope other men will resonate with so that you understand that your partnership is there as an opportunity for growth, as it has been for me as well. There are always situations where you will find that in relationship, it is the number one way to break through any mindset blocks you have about yourself or about other people. It's been such an incredible ride in my personal relationship. And I'm sure as you find in your own personal development journey that your relationship is the number one area for you to be the best version of yourself. So I do hope you get a lot out of this conversation with Kat Smailis. And before we dive into today's episode, I just want to give you the encouragement to step in and do the work. And what I mean by the work, I mean the deep emotional work. I know you've been listening to this podcast. You might have listened to a bunch of episodes. You might have listened to a few. Regardless, it is up to you to do the deep emotional work on yourself so that you can lead a life you love. The more you lean into that, the better your life will become. When I first started on the path to, I don't even want to say the word enlightenment, but just the path to emotional stability, I started to realize that I was responsible for every area of my life. I was responsible for the outcomes I was getting, even the ones that I didn't like. And the more you can take responsibility, the more you can take command of your world, and the more you can get the results you're looking for. If you are looking for support in this, I encourage you to step into our 3-day container. It is coming up in September of this year. We just launched spots, the Unbreakable Man experience. It is by far one of the most powerful experiences I've ever been a part of. I've facilitated many different events, and I put this one together specifically for men to test them to their limit so that they can find the truth within them. At the end of the day, when you do the work and you find out who you truly are, you can live in integrity. And when you live in integrity, you will feel that satiation you're looking for in yourself and in your life, and everyone else around you will feel the magnetism of that. You will get the results you're looking for. You will embody your masculine power, and you will show up in this world as a king. You will lead your life. So if you are feeling called to that, I encourage you to step in. We just launched spots to that 3-day container coming up in September. And you can find the link in our description, or you can also find it on my Instagram page at Unbreakable Man Coach and dive in. The other thing we got coming up, if you are looking to step in and do deep work, is our Brotherhood is about to relaunch. We put it on the side. We closed it for a minute. We're about to relaunch the Brotherhood and let guys in. We totally revamped it. We made it even better than it was. We added more course content. We made everything just that much better because we listened to you guys and we knew, all right, let's make this thing what we know it can be. So it's going to come with weekly calls. We are going to have, if you're in Austin, amazing. You might be able to get together with some of the other guys sort of informally, but we are going to have a leadership program along with it coming out here pretty quick as well. So if you want to be a leader in your community and get more men together so that we can create the brotherhood we're looking for on this planet, then that is exactly what our mission is. At the end of the day, we know one of the healthiest things we can do as men is create a sense of belonging. And the way you do that is you surround yourself with other like-minded men that are leading the life they want and showing up in the world as their best self. We're looking for high-performance men, elite men that want to just do good in this world. That's what we're doing in the Brotherhood. So if you're looking for a brotherhood, if you're looking for the support, the accountability, the challenge, then I encourage you to look for that. Like I said, we're going to relaunch that here very soon. So be sure to hop on the podcast to know when the next one is. And as always, enjoy today's episode. What is up, beautiful humans? This is Dr. Dave Cahotis. I am on a mission to forge strong, heart-centered, and purpose-driven men. And this podcast is here to help you stop managing your problems and start breaking free of stress, limiting beliefs, and excuses that stop you from executing at your fullest potential, living with passion, and being the man you want to be. Let's go. Kat, what's going on?
How are you?
I am well. I'm actually very excited to speak with you today because I saw recently that you stepped into the realm. Obviously, you were an intimacy coach for a long time now, and you just stepped into the realm and you started to specialize in working with men. One of the things I wanted to start with in our conversation in intimacy and in that relationship coaching world, what sent you on that path to work with men?
Well, I'm a therapist by trade, and I worked in the hospital for 5 years. I worked in physical medicine and rehab, and I was also a traveling therapist. So I've been all over the country seeking ever since I was like 16. I was like so interested in the healing space.
Yeah,
And then when I first stepped in the hospital, I was like, ew, this is not where healing happens, but I know I need to fully immerse myself in it so I can
yeah.
see there's holes. I can see how I want to do things better. And I spent time with people in very intimate positions. So in physical medicine and rehab, they're there for a long period of time, a lot of chronic illness, post stroke, post heart attack, post surgery. And the really, really sick patients that also had like nobody knew what was going on with them. They just got some like ambiguous diagnosis. I found out like I was the only one that actually asked them how their mental emotional state was,
Mm,
and like really talking to people about, okay, well, what led you to this outcome of like having this significant life event that happens or illness that is just like so prolonged? And they shared really intimate things with me, like, oh, I have terrible home life. I'm very depressed and sad because my significant other is not either not in a good place or they're just like disconnected, isolated, prolonged period of sadness, high stress jobs. I was like, "Oh, okay. So what we're doing in healthcare is like all wrong and it needs to take a more preventative approach." Of course, like most people end up knowing that, but how do you then sell into, "Oh, to do this preventative stuff so that you don't end up in a hospital gown for weeks to months to
mm,
years really sick." I was like, "Oh, if I go into the nerve or if I go into intimacy and talk about relationship dynamics, that at least allows people to be curious about what I have to say." And so I have this like back end arsenal of all this medical background and information and knowledge and stuff, but I'm packaging it like, "Oh, do you wanna make your relationship better?" Because if you can make your relationship better by learning emotional intelligence, nervous system regulation, understanding trauma, everything in your life starts to adjust to that state. And then I was talking to too many people. I'm like, "Oh, I can help you, and I can help your wife, and I can help the family dynamic." And it's like being a therapist or a doctor, you're like so focused on being able to help the bigger picture, but people who have a problem can't see the bigger picture. They're just focused on the specific problem. So my platform, my analytics, my all my stuff on my social media has been mostly men drawn to my page for various reasons.
mhm.
Uh, and if I can draw them in with like being a safe female to be on their team, be a friend to them, and just provide like unconditional love and support, I've
Yeah.
had really great relationships with men and lots of positive changes. So I just want to be a friend to men and have them show up better for their relationship because I know the end goal is that everything starts to adjust to focusing on one aspect. So
Yeah, and I love what you're doing. It's something to be said. As I was starting my healing journey, I kind of mentioned this early before you and I got started, is I'd been working with a lot of trauma for myself. I went through a financial trauma in losing a business. I had experienced traumas of war, and I knew I needed to get rid of this. And for, the route that I went, I tried traditional therapy, I tried conservative therapy. I never really truly went allopathic with relation to using any SSRIs or any antidepressants or any of that stuff. As Johns Hopkins started coming out with the research with psilocybin, I was like, All right, let's go. So that's honestly one of the big steps for me of allowing myself to surrender deeper into my body and let go. And as I was going, some of the most profound moments for me were in the containers. When I say container, I mean the healing space. We're in the containers with women. Now I see that there is absolute value, and the reason that we do all men containers spaces, there's a lot of value in men supporting men, because oftentimes it's like we're raised as young boys to see men as competition, and there's like this ribbing, this jabbing at each other without the depth of compassion in there. And when I was in a particular healing container, I was held. I remember being literally physically held by a woman with no agenda. And there was just pure no agenda. It was she's a dear friend of mine. And I remember feeling so seen, so appreciated, so honored just for my humanity from the feminine, that I remember just weeping and like letting go of something that I didn't even realize I was carrying. And we could call it mother wound, we could call it whatever word we want to add there. I remember feeling that sense of like, wow, I had no idea that women carry that medicine for men specifically. And I think it's a really important subject, obviously, because when it comes to healing spaces, women are also carrying in their traumas and men are carrying in their traumas. And there can be some confusion sometimes. There can be some crossover of this idea of sexuality, and men kind of get confused by that of like, does this mean that they like me? Am I liked by this person? One of the questions I really have, it's like, how do you work with that? How do you sort through that sense of being in that healing space and holding space if there is any physical attraction from the male coming towards the female?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is where each individual taking responsibility for their own healing and being an awakened person. I know a lot of people use that term, and to me, awakened means like, oh, I have the responsibility and the opportunity to be able to be the director and leader and creator of my life. So how do I go ahead and take responsibility for like what my boundaries are? And again,
Mm,
that's another word that's like thrown out
yeah.
because lots of people, like especially in homes where they were tumultuous, maybe became very sensitive to different energies within the family dynamic, and so you like don't know where your boundary is at.
Yeah.
You start to say or just agree to things that you're not necessarily comfortable with in the healing space where that dynamic could be happening. If you can bring a curiosity to, oh, how is my body feeling about this interaction? And
Mm,
then work with boundaries, you're like, it just doesn't feel resonant. It's not, I'm rejecting you. It's like, oh, something about this exchange doesn't necessarily feel resonant. And so using words like that is not the receiving partner being like, I'm rejected. It's just, oh, I'm not feeling in my body like that is a
mm,
yes for me at this
yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said the word boundary. And obviously, boundary is a deep somatic knowing of what is true for you and what is not true. And it's your ability to communicate that. And I think, obviously, when it comes to the healing space, generally there is very overt spoken boundaries. And then there's always the assumed boundaries, even though you don't want to necessarily assume anything. But having the conversation on the forehand or the forefront obviously is really important. You said a few words that I really like that obviously resonate with what we're doing. And obviously there's a lot of crossover with relation to nervous system regulation, trauma release, these things, even masculine feminine dynamic, which we'll talk about here in a second. But like, if a guy like, let's say, I'll just give you an example. Like, let's say there's a guy out there that's like, he's not getting the sex he wants. He's not getting the intimacy, which for me, we'll even say intimacy is not necessarily romance, but like sort of that deep interconnection. What would you do for like a guy? How would you start with a guy that's brand new to the stuff? He just knows that he's living more or less with a roommate
Yeah.
rather than like his partner. Hmm.
Yeah. Well, most men, because they're so ingrained of suppress the way that you feel, don't have a very large capacity for mental emotional depth.
Yeah.
And I'm
Hmm.
not saying that in being like you're wrong or you're dumb for like not having that. It's just you haven't had permission to go deep with the way that you feel. So
Yeah.
your container that you can hold is like very small.
Hmm.
There's there's that hermetic principle, as within, so without. Like, if you
Mhm.
haven't taken yourself to that level, then what you're able to actually hold for your person is pretty shallow. And meanwhile, women are more emotional. They're more in tune with their emotional state, not always, but they're used to like going real deep, like they are working with the moon every single day. They're going on a different, yeah, like emotional roller coaster. So they're like, you just don't understand me. And
Yeah.
so this is not even something that's conscious that they're aware of. They're like, I don't know how to relate to you because you can't relate to me. So just telling men, like, yes, if you want to relate better, if you want her to desire you more, we have to go on your own journey of understanding first and just make friends with the way that your body is feeling and really
Mm,
connect to the primal part of you and start
mm,
releasing from the somatic level this these primal holds that want to be released so that we can understand what is being guarded, what is being protected, what is being withheld. And in
mm.
releasing that, then you're like, oh my God, now I have awareness for like maybe why she might be feeling overwhelmed or sad or dissociated or whatever. But
Yeah.
it has to come from the bravery and the courage to say,
Mhm.
cool, even though I've heard that emotions are weak, they're really truly in the energetic space, our primary language.
Yeah.
So if you're rejecting the curiosity around trying to understand your emotional state, it's like you never learned your primary language.
Yeah, I love that. You mentioned, not having permission, and I feel that fully because growing up, I was in combative sports like football, wrestling back in the day, and then I went into literal combat in the army, and there was never a moment where I felt safe to express what I was experiencing. And I recently had a birthday, and I'm not going to blame my woes and my personality on where the stars were in the moment that I was born. But I I fully feel, dude, like I am a highly sensitive being and I feel everyone around me. I can feel even in this conversation, there is no separation. And if we want to go on hermeticism, I think you and I are tracking on the same way. There is no separation in anything. All things are energy. And the more you tune into that, it's obviously it's a superpower. So what I was experiencing back in the day was a lack of permission. And then what you're mentioning, and I love that, is you have to get to the point where you allow, not even just like it's someone else's permission
Mhm.
that you receive, like you're approval seeking in a way, but rather
Yeah.
you give yourself permission to feel. And I always like to ask this question to my guys when they come in. I'm like, guys that are in relationship or have been in a relationship, I'm like, how many of you guys, knew that your wife was the one that you wanted to marry based on the analytics? How many you put pros and cons down? And like nobody raises, like, how many of you knew it was based on a feeling? And everybody's like, oh, okay. I was like, all right, so feelings are our friends. Let's start there.
Ooh.
Let's start in that conversation, and then we can get into the conversation, and then we can, as we go, we start to have the conversation because there's even more depth to feeling. You start to get intuition. We start to work on vibe. I like to use also the term, have you ever, and this is a good question for you, have you ever been in a situation like, let's say you're at a bar, or back in the day, I haven't been in a bar in a long time, or like at a house party or something like that, and somebody walks in and you just don't like their vibe, and you just
Mhm.
know it and you feel it, and you're like, it's like the hair stands up on the back of the neck, and that is important because that's a moment that we are aware of energy and we're aware of the experience around us, and we're always tuning into that. And what you're mentioning with primary language, I love that, is that's it. That, like, we tune into the sensation around us. And it's not so much that we're thinking beings, we're actually feeling beings first. And that's how we experience the world around us. We all want the sensation, we all want the feeling. It's just, are you giving yourself permission?
And to further support that, it's not only like your intuition, it's your nervous system, it's speaking the language of your nervous system. So
Mhm.
that intuitive, like that person's vibe is off, is actually called neuroception, and it's like your sixth sense. So it's
Mhm.
developed in most people because most people are like, when you're little and you're like having some sort of feeling, your parents are like, stop acting that way. Like if you feel weird around your neighbor or something and you're like, Mom, that guy's weird, they're like, stop, like
Yeah.
fall in line. And then you
Yeah.
lose that intuitive, like I'm feeling my nervous system is saying no, but they're saying override that. So then it becomes like a lower volume sense that you're connected to.
Yeah.
So actually scientifically proven that that's a sense part of your senses. And another thing I wanted to mention was men are more repressed in their emotional expression than women, but women are also still in the repressed stage of like, I can't fully embody my emotions because if I do, I'm crazy. Or if
Yeah.
I do, I'm too emotional.
Yeah.
So it leads to a lot of chaos within them because they're like,
Mm,
need to express things, but they can't, so they suppress it. And both genders then are suppressing.
yeah.
And I think like in a relationship, a conscious relationship where two people are like actively working to know themselves, the woman in her full feminine expression is actually allowed and given the permission within that container to fully explore her emotional range and
Yeah.
like honored for that because again, as within so without, you are then being able to have permission through the expression of your woman. Her expressing herself gives you permission to like explore those areas, and then it just becomes this healing container that is
Yeah.
magic.
Yes. Yes. I fully agree with that. In fact, I actually had the question, sort of like in the opposite sense, right? Where the way, and let's kind of talk, like I'm going to shift gears. I do want to come back to primality. You mentioned the word primal, and I really love that word. It's very juicy for me, and I'm like, ooh, I love that. Like, let's get fucking primal. I want to like unpack that. I think it's really important for guys to understand what that means. But I kind of want to switch gears and talk about masculine feminine dynamic. And this doesn't necessarily mean, and I want to mention this too, it's like it doesn't necessarily mean in a heterosexual couple, masculine feminine energies are already within us. We already experience both masculine and feminine. Men experience both masculine and feminine. I think that's such a fear for men. I think women are in today's day and age, the ones that of course I'm watching, are embracing their masculinity, and that's being supported because women obviously carry both masculine and feminine energy as well. We carry both. It's our understanding and the nuance within us to differentiate between the two and use one or the other, and when to use it, right? So for instance, I have 3 children, and I'm not going to use, my masculine leadership energy when, my son just, skinned his knee. I'm going to tap into more of that nurturing essence, and also, sort of that steadfast fatherly essence as well. But what I wanted to mention or talk about, you mentioned the word container, and I love that. Um, Help me understand, or I guess like I kind of know, but like let's talk about that. Like when you say container and the flow in the middle of that, like paint me a picture of what that might look like.
The flow of the dynamic
The
energetic.
dynamic, yeah, like the masculine feminine dynamic and that polarity, like what creates that charge?
How I want to take this, I'm not sure it's going to answer like specifically your question, but again, hermetic principle, law of
Yeah.
polarity, like you are on this spectrum, and the more polarity there is, the more actual chemical charge that you have within the relationship dynamic. This has been kind of tricky because there's a lot of focus on the polarities right now, and like having men be like in their masculine and women be in their feminine. And I think that we're kind of like missing the boat on also recognizing that there's a lot of barriers that keep you from that natural expression of each polarity.
Mm,
Like when there's a lot of obstacles, it kind of like distorts where you might be at in the spectrum. So it depends on each couple, but like if you are both disconnected or you're both going through things that you're not sure are affecting the relationship, like you could be maybe even closer on the scale of polarity, which then is not like attractive. It's such an interesting topic. I'm not really sure how I feel about the polarity side of things because I'm so focused on first helping them to just get to their baseline and then
yeah.
allow the natural expression of each of those polarities. But man, I mean, women are it almost seems like we are experiencing a shift in the paradigm of like women feeling unsafe, so they go really far into their masculine, and then
Yeah.
men feeling really repressed, so then they become docile. And so
Yeah.
there's this weird shift that has happened. And so how do you get people to midline? And then how do you get them to their natural expression so things aren't so
Mm.
tangled? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's
That
just
may
from
no, I mean, like that. I think that makes sense a lot. I totally agree with you with relation to men feeling docile and women being more in their masculine and it being supported. I mean, I think just even the concept of when it started to come out, this idea of toxic masculinity and sort of this attack on men and manliness, and even the APA came out with guidelines that masculinity, and even if they use the word traditional masculinity, they still use the word masculinity, which is carries its own weight and its own moniker, that it is dangerous and harmful to boys and men. And it's one of those articles that really kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because I feel that you are correct in the sense that when we tell men that they're bad for their primality, for what is deep inside of them, then they are going to continue to repress that. It's going to go into the shadow element of self, and they're not going to allow themselves to go back into their nature of who they truly are. And then there's this interesting dynamic of what you were describing, where women will fall in like, are you going to go clean the garage? One of those, like, starting to call men out. And I'll give an example. My wife called me out yesterday for telling the kids that they cannot watch YouTube. And then I was like, somebody turned on YouTube. I was like, all right, fine. Like, let's turn on YouTube, whatever. And like, there's certain shows that I let them watch, like science shows and whatnot. And then she like got in not my face. That's the wrong way to say it, describe it. But she called me out like, well, are we watching this or not? And I'm like, like I was, it was one of those moments for me that was really kind of forefront. I was like, oh, I got to step away and realize, okay, I'm being called out. I get it. I was kind of wishy-washy. It wasn't in alignment in my integrity.
yeah.
But I'm gonna come back to kind of this masculine feminine dynamic of understanding, because you were mentioning this sort of idea of when women feel safe and the feminine feels safe, that she can express herself and allow herself to go there. It's in a moment where the man is holding space, and then he is allowing himself to be like, oh, this is fun. I can dance. Oh, you're having a sort of a dance party by yourself in the living room. I want to join you. Like, this is fun, rather than kind of gruffly like walking in and moving. So I think, long story short, kind of discussing like that element. And you mentioned like polarity. That for me is polarity. I'm really actually excited that we're having this conversation, because like I'm trying to find better words to use here, because for me that meant, or that means, polarity. I'm curious what your take is on sort of the masculine feminine dynamic, if you can even put words to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that analogy, a dance, like being like, cool, I'm having a dance party with you. I love to
Yeah.
bring fun and like the goofiness to all things that I do, because I think people get really far into, I need to go search the depths of my soul to try to heal this thing, and then they forget to like have fun and find pleasure along the way. So I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Uh, Masculine and feminine. Masculine is the goal oriented, accomplishing, direct, strong container, and the feminine is flowing and creative and more nurturing and, yeah, just like flowing, and both people, as you mentioned, like have that capacity. I also would maybe even like to say like a gas and a brake. The gas is go, 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 like masculine, go drive, do, accomplish, and the feminine is like wait,
Mm.
but stay and like be
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
this moment and be stuck, and it's the gas and the brake of the nervous system. So I don't know, I think those terms are ever evolving, like, and I hope soon people are like, oh, the feminine energy doesn't mean this bad thing and we can wipe that out of our genetic coding. But uh,
Yeah.
like just trying to give people, again, permission to say, well, if it's masculine, feminine, it's also black or white, gas or brake, dark and light, just different ways of them relating to these energies that are inherent and needed in a balanced human.
Mm. Yeah, I've heard the analogy, and I really like the analogy of the banks of a river. There's a book called Open Her. I forget the author's name. I don't know if you've read it. And she describes that the masculine energy in the dynamic of a relationship is the banks of the river, and the river itself, the flow of the river, the thing that brings life to this, surrounding areas, is the flow and the water within. And such that the container, being the riverbank, is there, it provides stability and support. and essentially providership of the river itself. If the banks cease to exist, if they're not steadfast and in holding space, and they break, well, what happens is the water goes everywhere and it becomes chaos. It becomes chaotic. And I think that's where we get this idea of femininity is at times chaotic when it's big, when it's overflowing. You think about a flood, it just like, like just comes and wipes everything out. But sometimes we actually need that in the same sense to clean house. And so that in order for both male and female to feel safe, they have to be able to go within and experience themselves, so that the man in general, I say the man in general, holds the masculine container, and the woman in general, I'm not saying this is not always like an absolute, but in generally holds the feminine container and brings that sense of flow and play and these things. And my wife and I actually had a conversation about this very recently, that she actually craves that I bring my own femininity into the family in that space, because we went on a like a four-wheel drive ride out at my in-laws. They have a ranch, and it's here in Texas, and we were going up, we called it Roller Coaster Hill, and I was just like in a really good mood, and I was just like, I had already done all the work that I needed to do that day, and I was like, we were just blasting off, and it was like this very memorable moment for all the kids. And she noted that it was like in my wife's brain, that was it, like that was the moment that I saw your femininity come out, and I loved that, and I want that, and I crave that. And I, in that sense, like I get it, where it's like when you get your shit done, be disciplined, do the masculine thing, like make the sales calls, make the certain dollar point, whatever it is, and then come home and like have a dance party. I think I mentioned that to you the other day. One of the things on my daily dial, I call it my daily dial. Every day I have a dance party, because that is me tapping into my flow. I have to do that. It's like for my own personal well-being. If I don't, I become very gruff and way too serious, like you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
One
Go
that
ahead.
came up while you were speaking, men are being pressured to hold a container for women for their emotional state. And I think it also adds a lot of pressure on the man, that they're like,
Mm,
not only do I have to go out and accomplish and provide, but now I have to come home and like hold space in this container and continue to be on. And
mm,
I think I really like working with men, because there's this analogy about like a wolf in the wolf pack. He's like the leader representing the masculine, he's leading,
yeah.
and he's always on. And if he has to come home and be on for her, then he never gets a chance to like relax and
Mm,
into his parasympathetic state, and that's not sustainable. So he starts to dissociate or become like he needs to distract himself, or experiences burnout, but then feels shame and like works himself into illness. So as a female, yeah, like literally,
yeah.
so I like to acknowledge that in men, and also be kind of like the advocate for women to say, if you are emotionally reactive, or you don't have a solid grasp, or I notice that you have a dysregulated nervous system, like your responsibility in the dynamic is to do the healing, to be able to express your emotions and also learn to manage them and come back down to a regulated state, so that you can be the pack leader in the inner world. Take the
Yeah.
reins for your man to, like, be able to feel relaxed and allow that inner child to be expressed. You are the master of the inner world, the home environment, and the man is the
Mm,
master of the external world, and in that way, you can see why the masculine and the feminine are so needed for evolution of worlds, or, like, to build new worlds because of that
mm. I feel so seen in that conversation, because I will raise my hand and say that is absolutely, the way I was operating for a long time, being in this healing space, and seeing the way my wife would respond or react, for a better word, when I would come home and I would be in a bad mood. It was almost like she would shut down and then be really pissed at me, and then I'd be like, "Well, I need to." But again, I was also looking for like her appreciation and her love, and like I was like craving it. And so I'm like, "All right, I'm gonna go be better, like I'm gonna go do more deep healing." And then I'd go off into the next retreat or the next ceremony or whatever it is. And I'd come home. And what was really interesting in our dynamic was I went so deep. I stepped into a container and I experienced ayahuasca,
Mhm.
and that brought me through, like, talk about open me up to the universe. I saw it all. Like, I saw literally everything that this universe is and what the universe is providing and source, and like the one mind of God. And it was like, what? Like, it was crazy. And then I came back and I tried to explain this. And I was like, after that, dude, I was like cracked wide open. And I'm in the backyard, my shirt off, and like loving life, giggling, and like my wife thought I was in pure psychosis and she didn't feel safe all of a sudden. And I was like, what? Like, I don't understand. Like, this is what you wanted, like you wanted me to lighten up and be free and all of these things. And so, what I love what you were describing. How would you approach it from that sense then, of sort of the opposite, where it's like instead of the man being too tight, he's almost like too loose in a way, and then she doesn't feel safe in the same sense. It's like, yeah.
I mean, plant medicine, I'm a huge advocate for because I think it allows people to wake up to those different aspects of the universe and oneness and stuff, but
Yeah.
also it can like really disorient your nervous system into finding your ground again.
Yeah.
So for a little while, I was doing integrative work. So after people would do a journey, they would come. Actually, I'm still doing that, but I'm not solely focusing on it
Mm,
because in the plant medicine space, great, all these people are doing ceremonies, but they're not doing the integration of recalibrating their nervous system or
yeah.
their relationship to the physical plane of which we live.
Yes.
So living on a different dimension,
Yeah.
which is like disorienting for you, disorienting for your nervous system, and really confusing for people who are in your environment on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So just providing education on what's happening and allowing through somatic experiencing, through somatic processing, you to be able to find your feet again. Because again, if you're all the way on that side of the paradigm and then you blow your neurology and you end up over here, all we have to do is scale you back to find midline so that
Mm.
you're, oh, I have seen that, but I also know how to bring it back to here.
Yeah. So like maybe walk me through maybe a practice or two, or maybe a framework of what you use for a guy that's out there in the plant medicine space. He's working with psilocybin, he's working with ayahuasca or bufo or whatever plant medicine, because it's starting to become very popular, especially with CEO types. What would you do for those guys?
Honestly, there's like basic grounding techniques where you go outside and you put your feet on
Mm,
the ground, or you like touch a tree. The trees, and as you probably know, like elements in nature are very grounding. And so
yeah.
just like getting out into the primal expression, but really just sitting with like, oh, my feet are on the earth. I feel whatever you need to feel from that to pull ions. I don't know that part of like energetics, but being by the ocean allows you to absorb certain ions that are regulating. Being in nature is just really re-regulating. Also noticing body position. So like
Mm,
if you're in if your head is somewhere on the clouds and you're like is super jacked and ready to take over the world and fix and save humanity, like you might notice that you're really forward oriented, like you're like ready to go. You might notice that your posture looks like an animal being ready to like go do something, right?
yeah.
But if you just allow yourself to sit back in that experience and like notice things in the environment, it allows you to gain a wider perspective on just like orienting yourself to the present moment versus being like hyper focused on one thing that you're thinking about. I know you mentioned like skipping outside and being like free and stuff. Then you might need to pull some sympathetic charge back into you. So it depends on where
Yeah.
you're at in the spectrum. But if you're like dancing outside, then it might be helpful to lean forward to start activating that vagal response to add sympathetic charge into your system. And I know that's a lot of language that kind of needs more explanation on a podcast, but that's kind of like where my initial thought would go.
Yeah, and I mean, to add context, I mean, yes, I was for sure. I'd go outside. I'd have conversations with the trees and Pachamama and all of these things, and then I would be able to go to work and be able to function. But from the outside perspective, I was very much like, my personality was absolutely totally different. And that was part of my ceremony, was also like seeing my timeline of who I was before and then who I am after, and now showing up as the man that I now am. And in the beginning, everyone's like, what is Dave doing? What is he up to? I was doing somatic release breath work with people. And from the outside perspective, it looks like exorcisms are happening. And then people are starting to inquire, like, can you help me? Are you gonna, it's like, yeah, for sure. So I love what you're describing about, obviously you're using some words like sympathetic and parasympathetic, which is simply the fight or flight response that people don't recognize. It's part of the autonomic nervous system, which is no longer actually autonomic, which is like, we thought it was like automatic, like we couldn't control it. We can actually control it nowadays. And we do that through breath, through grounding, like you're saying, getting physically on the earth. The ions you're describing are perfect. I love that. It's literally like every cell has a charge. There's some really cool science done on wound healing, and they discovered the actual physical wound. Let's say you have a wound on your arm and you're looking at it from an ionic perspective. The torn tissue is a positive ion, and the healthy tissue on the outside is a negative ion. So what they did is they simply wrapped it in a copper sheath, and then they allowed that the negative ions from the copper to heal the wound, and it healed 5 times faster than the control group. And that's why, this is very random, but the copper socks, like on late night TV,
Yeah.
you see Brett Favre with these things. That's really what they're doing. Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of science behind the idea of what's called grounding or earthing, literally taking your shoes off, and shoes and socks, and physically standing on the earth for about 10-15 minutes a day. You can reduce inflammation, you can do all these things. So that's like definitely a little fun fact of the day. I love that. I mean, I literally do that every day now. I can't physically, actually, like right before you and I got on the podcast, I did that because I knew I needed to just ground and be there, like be present, which is great. So, okay. So let's kind of go back to the guy that just starting to kind of deepen his sense of self. He's starting to get a little bit deeper into his emotions and his emotional body. You mentioned the word primal. Talk to me about that, and then how can we incorporate our primality?
Well, all of the modalities that you are using are very primal. Like,
Mm,
we think as humans that we know better than nature, and we're stupid for thinking that. Like, getting
yeah,
up, putting your feet on the ground, on the actual ground and earth, is more healing than any sort of pill that you can take. So
yeah,
it's recognizing that we are first and foremost at our most basic level an animal.
yep.
And if we are overriding that by trying to be too analytical, then we're missing 90% of actually what is going on. So your primal nature is getting even back to your reptilian brain, like knowing how your reptilian brain is all working for survival always. So
Mm,
if you're working with the language of the nervous system, especially in relationships, know that you are always operating at the most basic level. Am I safe or not?
mm,
And even safety, like safety gets thrown around, like, you make me feel safe. That it's kind of frustrating that people are like talking about that so much, but it's really like, am I in a threatening situation psychologically, physically, mentally, emotionally, or not? And if we
yeah.
feel that we are, but we know after a second of thinking, like, oh, okay, I'm not physically in danger. This is that overriding response that you were talking about, that it's not automatic always. Like, oh, we can recognize we're not physically in harm's way of being hurt, then we can use our advanced human mind to kind of uncover what the block, the psychological threat we're feeling is, and bring awareness and make friends with that animalistic side of us that's
Mm,
always working to keep us physically alive.
yeah, 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 absolutely. And you mentioned it, I mean, a couple times, this idea around safety, and you mentioned it earlier as well, that there's sort of this thing happening that I notice, and it's like this idea that the masculine container, must carry the responsibility to make the feminine holder safe.
Yeah.
And I latched onto that idea. I'm like, yes, I will do that. I will win the day and like be the white knight. And even as we're speaking it, I'm like, dude, I'm fucking tired. I'm so
Exactly.
fucking tired of like carrying all the weight.
Yeah. I
Like,
know
can we?
you've taken several deep breaths, and so I know your animal body is responding to what I'm saying, and you
Yeah.
feel truth in what's coming up.
Yeah. Yeah. No, very much. Actually, it didn't even like occur to me that I was still carrying that belief system, and it's coming out like in the form of deep physiologic sighs of like, yeah, I was carrying that because part of the dynamic that I have with my wife is, as I was going through my healing journey, I wanted to create more intimacy again. And that included more sex, more and better sex, and all the things that we think about when it comes to intimacy and also safety in our connection and just feel deeply. And I sort of assumed, I don't know why I was doing this, but it just was in my mind that I was going to go out. I was going to heal myself so that I could come home and like create this safe container so that she can do, whatever she needs to do to sort of not match me in the sense, but like, we could be on the same wavelength. And it's been very fascinating because I've actually challenged her more just by
Mm,
me doing my work. And it's been, I will even use the word dysregulating for her. And this happens, and I see this with many couples, and maybe you can speak to this, is like when one person is growing and the other person is not, it's like we were not a vibrational match. We were not on the same wavelength at all. And it was very hard to communicate, even energetically, right? Like from our heart center. Do you see that happens with one person or even in couples that are both growing? Like, do you see that?
yeah. So I work with men specifically, but I always encourage their spouse or partner to come along for the ride. So that
Okay.
looks like if they do decide both to work with me, they both individually have their own sessions. And then we come together for a couples session once a month. It's not like we're in a couples session all month because I think more actually happens when you do individual work. And then I help to mediate the language needed to retune them to each other. But
Mm,
you're doing, truthfully, people, some of my clients are like, my husband doesn't want me to do this work anymore because I'm too different right now.
mm,
But it causes chaos within the dynamic because all of a sudden there's a demand for growth, like growth and growing
yeah.
pains. And unfortunately, I mean, fortunate, whatever, like, unfortunately, if the separation happens, it's because you're evolving into your own path of individuation, and
Mm,
it might not be at the same trajectory or path that this person wants to go. So if people end up, like, sometimes I work with people who are kind of like on the brink of separation, and if that does happen, at least they're like coming from a place of a more amicable and understanding place. So like, oh wow, we're just like growing in completely different directions. So how do I love you in your own journey of finding yourself or discovering more about yourself, while we can co-parent or while we can exist and not hate each other.
yeah.
Uh, so I don't remember what your initial
I've
question was.
been well, no, like I want to touch to that. Yeah, like we were kind of talking about
Oh
just
yeah,
growing, like
yeah,
one person growing and the other person not. And vulnerably, I will share like in February of this last year, like I found myself feeling like I had expanded and I was still serving up this like limited flavor of Dave. And I was
yeah,
still coming back and I was trying to put myself into a box so as to maintain some semblance of stability in our relationship. And it was so stifling for me that I was like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. And we had some deep, deep conversations. And of course, there's tears and all these things. What was also happening in that same time, and this is really interesting, and I'm hyper aware of energy. It's just the way I operate. And yeah, I was mentioning it's, I don't want to blame my life and my personality on, what time of year I was born, but it's just,
the
it's in my,
cancer.
yeah, I'm a Cancer for sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, anyway, we know each other. Like, hey, are you hypersensitive and you need to hold boundaries a lot more? It's like, yeah,
I'm a
yeah.
freaking double cancer.
Oh wow, that's big.
Yeah.
That's yeah. I wow. I feel like you're in, girl. Like you are in it, like in the depths always, and especially right now, about what's going on too. There's a lot of stuff going on in watery, like emotional stuff happening right now. My wife is I'm gonna talk, we're not, I usually don't talk about astrology, but I'm gonna fuck it. I'm gonna just go this direction because this is who I am. Because I love this shit. I love like the edge of the woo woo. My wife is ascending in Cancer, and I am a sun sign in Cancer, and so I'll go out there and I'll overtly do all this work, and then like for her, she needs to, when she's doing her deep work, she is her best. When she's not, it's obviously like, we butt heads, and I'm like, come on, like I know you're blocking yourself, like I thought we got through this 4 months ago. Kind of going back to what we were describing, in February of this past year, I was going through, it first started with a Kundalini rise just one Saturday. And all of a sudden I feel this energy moving up my spine, and I could literally like feel it like a snake just kind of going all the way up. And my life started to fall apart right after that. And what was happening was I was recognizing that I was still projecting my inner feminine on my wife. I was
Mm,
still doing masculine activities, meaning I was going out and getting the paycheck, or I was going to work, or I was even just like cleaning the garage. And I was expecting my wife to come back and fulfill my feminine needs in the form of sex, in the form of conversation, in the form of nurturing, in the form of whatever. I was still expecting that. And I didn't recognize it because it was subconscious, but it was like this was starting to happen. And what was happening was I was psychologically separating from my wife. And this was like a crazy time. Like I was in it. I was deep, deep in it for a minute. And what I fully allowed, because I'm this kind of guy, like I fully surrendered to whatever happens. And I allowed myself to create that, we'll call it divine union. And I've heard that term before, and it fits here because both my masculine and feminine elements came together, my essence, and they had this divine union in of self. And it was during a breath work experience that I just sort of saw them as pillars, because I was still, for the longest time, and you were mentioning it in the way you're describing, like it's not the man's job to always create the safe space, but I was still in my mind putting, because I fucking adore women. Like I want to bow. I just like want to protect. I'm like this, I don't know, it's like this thing in me. And I was still putting the masculine slightly below the feminine, as if it's less important, but it's, hey man, like let's get out there and let's be better men so that the feminine can rise. And I was realizing that that actually wasn't correct either, that it needs to be truly balanced between both ends. And until it's truly balanced in the individual self and across the collective, we're still going to create an imbalance collectively. And that shows up in the form of patriarchal thinking and governance, or the way we operate on planet Earth, and the way we extract resources, and all of these things. I'm finding now that we're coming online, that we're starting to experience masculine and feminine energies. And I'm curious, from your perspective, it's obviously you're working with both men and women. Do you teach that there is masculine and feminine in both? And then how do you like maneuver through that and help people like articulate with those energies?
well, first of all, that was a great tangent of that really great. Like that was really good.
Thank you.
Clip that and put it on your Instagram. That's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, great. My main focus is to just simply focus on the foundational aspects. So I'm teaching emotional intelligence
Mm,
and nervous system regulation.
yeah.
So that just developing a universal language of communication and connection. I don't say that I'm going to focus on polarities until further down in their ascension or progression process, because
Mhm.
first they need to know themselves. They need to be able to understand how a relationship is going to continue to help them to know themselves. And then what is the natural progression and the sexual expansion that you can get into. But it's
Mm.
not really like, talk about ancient philosophy. I just went to Egypt and I taught, yeah, I went
I
to
just got
Egypt,
so excited.
yeah, earlier this year, and it fucked my world up.
Oh my God, please tell the story.
Oh man, I did so many crazy things, and I was on this trip with like 80 of just brilliant minds. Every conversation was like jumping in a rabbit hole, and then you just like
Mm.
have this unlocking, and then I was in 15 different sacred sites, so I'm just downloading like all of this stuff, and I came back here and was like, wait, what? How do I? It's just like you were saying, you were flying around outside. I was like,
Yeah.
how do I exist here when I just
Yeah.
experienced all of that? But in ancient civilizations where there was magic happening, they
Mm.
also saw sex as this like container for transcendence and magical experiences, but they also respected each individual's journey of knowing themselves and learning how to master the root, sacral, and solar plexus chakra, so that the people were living from their heart, and then from the heart space they were teaching them sex magic principles and like crazy the union that you were talking about, that union that happens is actually like an enlightened being. And from the space of living from your heart and higher centers, you're more humanitarian based, you're more worried about ecology, you can unlock higher levels of consciousness. But they didn't want people to be stuck in lower level thinking in order to practice those higher level sexual things.
So you just cracked open a whole door and I want to go in. Talk. So, like I'm so curious. I mean, number one, being in the space that I've been in and higher levels of consciousness, like I've had downloads of lives in Egypt and like deep wisdom coming through, and you're like, what the fuck is happening? Like some crazy things, like these downloads.
Yeah.
Um, give me, I mean, I don't know if this is your area of expertise and I want to honor your expertise, but like give me the good stuff, man. Like what talk to me about what you learned with relation to like commanding, the three levels of centers and sex magic. Do you know anything about that? Is that your,
The
you
three
know,
levels of centers, tell me more about that.
well, like you're mentioning, like, obviously your root, your sacral
Yeah.
chakra, your solar plexus, and how sex magic can play into relationship and how we can use sex to ascend to higher levels of consciousness. I don't know if this is in your realm or not, but I'm so
Yeah.
curious about this stuff.
So people were not taught the principles of sex magic or sexual transcendent practices until they mastered the lower three centers. So
Okay.
they were deemed initiates when they were able to achieve the level of their heart or higher. And then they ancient Egyptians saw relationships as an opportunity to like break through your own container, because we all hit like a ceiling at some point, right? Like,
Mm,
hey, this is as high as I can go myself. So you bring another initiate in, and through this, the practice of tantra or breath work or just intentional relating, you can create kundalini rising.
yeah.
And the snakes travel to your head. You talked about this, but there's a masculine and feminine part of your brain that actually have sex, and then they release chemicals that bathe all your cells and create this enlightened state. And so
Mm,
at orgasm, they were teaching people that you direct the energy from orgasm to your energy body or a manifestation of something, a creation.
yeah.
And you can do that by yourself, like you can practice it. But when you have two people who are intentionally working to create something that is outside of their physical body, it has double the power.
Hmm.
So relationships really are like a secret weapon that is available to all of us, but there's not great resources to learn the
Yeah.
ascension.
And I've started to see the idea of sex magic started to come around, and I'm curious. I think, I mean, a lot of men listening are like, sex magic, what the fuck is that? It's like, it's very much an advanced practice. And now that I've experienced what I've experienced with, again, the masculine, feminine, and the Kundalini rise, and I will say, like, having a Kundalini rise is not for the faint of heart. It's it sounds amazing because it feels like a 3 hour orgasm, and you're just like sort of, it's like this incredible sensation inside of your body. But what happens is that there is this up leveling required on the back end of that. It felt like when it first happened, this was like back, I was just meditating. This was like back in 2015 or 2016. I remember like meditating, and all of a sudden it just popped, and I just went into this intense orgasm sensation in my body. I didn't know what to do with it, but then my life completely fell apart. I lost my business. My wife and I, we miscarried. It was like this intense unraveling. I didn't know which way was up. I didn't know if I was going to stay in the career I was going to stay in. It was like very unnerving for a minute. And it took me a while to get myself back. And then as I've been progressing and got to this now point, I knew what to do with it. So I just wanted like kind of mention that if anybody's looking at advancing their consciousness using sex magic and looking for a kundalini rise, because if you ask for it, you'll get it, and it'll feel great for a short while, but then your life is gonna you're gonna have to unpack some things. I don't know. Have you ever experienced that sensation?
Yeah, so we did several cap experiences in Egypt,
Okay, of course.
on the Nile River.
Oh my God.
And when I got back, I decided I'm actually moving out of Texas.
Oh wow.
And I also had that same like, fuck this. I'm not doing this anymore. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want to work with people one on one. Like I don't know what I want to do anymore. But super disorienting. I've never had it to that extent, but I definitely asked for it and put myself in the situation where I mean, it was inevitable. I just said yes to everything while I was there, and we did lots of crazy things.
Yes.
So yeah, definitely not for the faint of heart. Your internal life will feel like you are physically dying, and then your
Yeah.
external life, as within, so without, has to start to match the transformation that's happening from inside of you. So
Yes. Yeah. Is there a point, and you mentioned this, is there a point where a relationship no longer serves one another? Have you seen that?
yeah, I mean, I've seen it in my own experience too. It's a really felt experience. It's like
Yeah.
it's like swimming upriver for a long period of time against a current, and you're just like, this is not with the flow.
Yeah.
And so it encouraged people, like it might be because you're holding on so much, the attachment of what you initially agreed to. So if you just like actually let things all fall apart and then you reconnect at some point, maybe a little bit further down the road or immediately, like once that commitment that you originally made is lifted and there's like more freedom to explore what's new, then you can find your way back to each other and rebuild from a place of like this new version of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's very much what I felt with my wife in February. And actually shared this story on the podcast earlier, but I'll share with you. It's like when you start to unpack and start to go deeper into your own consciousness, and we can play in the world of energy, you start to have experiences that again are very outside the normal, everyday, mundane, go to work and come back kind of thing. You start to experience past lives. And I started having these past life regressions, like sort of in a moment. I'd be sitting here at my desk, and all of a sudden I'd be like in ancient Greece. And I'm like, what? Like having these experiences and reliving traumas. It's been a wild ride, but all along the way, everything that has come to me is sort of by design for me, for my own personal ascension process. And I met my divine union. This was another woman, not my wife. And I was blown away when I first met this individual. It was like through a mutual friend. And I was like, whoa, like this is crazy. Like having all these like downloads and past life memories and seeing like, I had to relive the trauma of us separating when she died in another life and, all these things. And she's having like all of these same downloads and all of these crazy things. And, in the moment, I didn't think really anything of it. I was like, well, I'm going to honor the contract that I have with my wife. Like, this is our contract. I'm going to honor this. This is our third dimensional, like, realness. So, like, there's no confusion for me that I love you, but like, there's no confusion for me. So, like, there's nothing here. And so, that was very well known and understood and communicated. And then as time went on, like, I couldn't put that shit down. Like, I just like, why is this on my heart? I'd be like meditating, and then like this other person would just like hop on my heart. I'd be like, what? Like, what do you want? As if I'm speaking to her and like putting it down. And so what was necessary, and this is what was shown to me, and this is like February when things were starting to kind of fall apart, was a representation for me. It's just again energy, a representation for me to fully surrender, as you're mentioning, and let go. And it wasn't that I have to be physically with this other individual, but that it was my opportunity to create divine union within myself. And I still needed to separate from my wife psychologically, even though we were still very much married and like very much like living our normal life. But like sort of psychologically, it's as if I was a totally different individual. We had to go we actually stopped having any physical intimacy for like 6 weeks. And so it was like this deep reset. And what was shown to me was like, oh, that was for that reason. I needed to know what that true divine love felt like.
Hmm.
And so that I could create that for myself. it sounds like you and I could totally geek out on like the deep. We could just go on for hours about this, which I love. I mean, I'm really curious about Egypt. I don't want to sidetrack too much, but let me shift gears. Let me shift gears for us really quick and kind of bring it back to like the everyday guy that wants, you know, he wants to get more sex and he wants to have more intimacy. Obviously, that's, your area of specialty. What would you say to a guy that's like he's just not getting the sex he wants and he wants to be able to get more depth and intimacy with his wife? He's starting to do some inner work, he's starting to do some nervous system regulation. What would be the next step?
Well, always telling or sharing the insights that he's getting with her and kind of inviting her along in the journey. I also have on my website, I have like a 30-minute video about how stress is the main reason why lots of people can't get into the state of connection and deeper intimacy. And
Yeah.
our society is really built off of being very highly stimulating. So just even understanding that the disconnection or the inability to take yourself to a deep level has a lot to do with stress. And just hearing that allows things to start to shift. So I would encourage you to learn as much as you can about the nervous system and always just start sharing the little tidbits and how it's shifting you. And,
Yeah.
the big thing is like when you take in the information and you really put it to practice, you shifting energetically is going to allow them to be curious versus you being like, oh, I found out you need to do this because I did it and it made me feel good. So maybe
Yeah.
take a little bit of the stress off that you changing is doing more than 50% of the work to evoke their curiosity to also come with you on the ride.
Yeah. And I can second that, like honor yourself first. At the end of the day, you're the one that lives with you. Like, yeah, obviously we all want deep connection. And sometimes we find that the individual we're with isn't truly the one that's gonna satiate the depths of our being. And they were there for a time and it was important. I don't want to get into the uncoupling phase. I am curious if you have any uncoupling strategies, but it's always a tough conversation talking about breaking up and separating and these things. But I've seen this happen more and more and more. I think we're becoming more evolved beings. Modern relating is very, I want to say ambiguous is the right word, but like even the idea of polyamory and things starting to come into form now that like people are questioning a lot of things. Sort of non-romantic, non-platonic relationships are like becoming a thing now too. And I'm like, what does that even mean? I don't even
Yeah,
know. So
probably a cop out, but we won't go into that.
yeah, yeah, totally, totally, totally. So yeah, I mean, I think that's important to note. Let me ask you a few questions, and then just kind of we'll throw some spitfire at you and kind of get some ideas. What what is your definition of intimacy, and how do you achieve it?
Feeling seen, heard, and understood as the person that you really are versus the person you think that you have to be. And you achieve it by allowing yourself to start to carve out the root system of your being, take yourself to the depths, and also allow yourself to do the opposite of that and start to expand in your own, finding your purpose, finding your mission, finding what sparks you up about life, and just like living your life to the fullest expression. Allows you to just be intimate with not only other people but the planet and the universe. And
Yeah, yeah, I love that. What creates connection in relationships?
what creates connection in relationships? That's a good question. What creates connection? I think really having the curiosity to understand someone and making that be a priority allows the language of your nervous system to relax in the presence of this person while also being someone that supports and pushes them towards growing. So you're both providing that space for vulnerability and depth, but also encouraging them to evolve. I think in my own experience, that is what creates connection.
Yeah. Are there any physical activities that you would like, any physical practices that you would use there to increase connection?
One of the things I like to give people is to do like a basic tantra position. So you're sitting on the ground facing each other, and you can close your eyes if you feel intimidated to look in their eyes, but just being like present in the moment with them and focusing on how you feel, how they feel, how you feel to each other allows you to tap into the energetics of true connection. And just like even sitting in that space for 5 minutes a day allows people to start to open up little by little. And then before you know it, you're like sitting on the floor talking to each other for 2 hours about things you haven't said to each other. So just like a really basic, easy skill to jump into each other's electromagnetic fields.
I love that. Sounds like clothes on for that practice.
Optional.
Optional. I like that. That sounds like a lot more fun on my end. Yeah, for sure. What if I wanted to create more depth in my relationship, what would I need to do?
Man, you really digging into my brain here. More depth. I think I just being honestly just being curious about yourself and
Mm,
not and changing or reframing any of these beliefs that like, no, it's too dark there, like, oh, I can't go there. Just be playfully curious about yourself. And I think things will start to open up to you a lot more to allow you to go deeper. So it's not necessarily like a dark, scary place. It's like, oh, just unknown, and I'm curious, and I'm an explorer of my own experience.
yeah, I love that. I mean, that is very true. It's you have to know yourself. It's like I've heard this before that intimacy is into me, I see, and the ability to go deeper within yourself and sit with all the dark squirrely parts of you, like, okay, I see that. Okay, that's gonna be okay. And then opening yourself up to having obviously depth and more connection in these things. I do like
Yeah.
the connection you're talking about. I've noticed for me personally, the three things is physical touch, is breath, breath together. It just creates this electromagnetic pulse and eye contact. Those three things create connection, and true connection. And that's true for anybody. It's one of the reasons that like when you're speaking, obviously like we're on I'll try to like stare into the camera. We're on a medium like this, but like even when I'm speaking, I can see like you're looking at me, even though like I'm doing my best to also look at you. It's like we want to be able to do that. Uh,
Yeah.
Naturally, it creates connection, and I think obviously it's important.
Yeah. And well,
Yeah,
people also just for like people sometimes have a really, really hard time with eye contact.
yeah.
And because it's kind of like a dominating versus submissive thing. So
Mm,
if that becomes something that's challenging in this dynamic of you sitting with your partner and they can't look at you in the eyes, being curious about that response and asking loving questions like, what can I do to make you feel safer, might evoke an emotion of them crying or needing to sit in your lap or be held. So that
yeah.
barrier becomes an invitation to know them at a deeper level just by being curious about, what is keeping you from looking in my eyes.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. If you had from your own perspective any words of advice, like you're on your last dying breath, right? Like and you want to tell the world about relationships, what would that be?
Man, these are
I'm throwing you
my
in.
last dying breath. Relationships are the most like magical container for self ascension and
Mm,
who really create the life that you could ever, your biggest dreams can be made through the container of your relationship. So just open yourself up to seeing that like you being in a relationship is actually having a secret weapon and it has so many things to unlock. It's a ever evolving video game that is exciting and he doesn't have to be monotonous and boring and yeah, like you can unlock so many levels through that union.
I love it. I mean, I'm throwing you curveballs and you're knocking them out of the park right now. I think this is great. Before we sign off, anything else that you want to share?
Anything else you want to share? I mean, if you need help with the intimacy, I got you. I
Yeah,
like
yeah,
to
yeah.
keep it. I like to keep it fun, and that's what it should be. Like when
Absolutely.
it's being fun and it's stagnant, then you know that the trajectory of your relationship is kind of like on the outs. But if you can keep things fun and joyful and curious and playful, like that's where your relationship can thrive.
I love that. Yeah. And then how can the people work with you? Do you have programs, one-on-one? What does that look like?
Yeah, I currently work one-on-one with people, and I'm about to launch a how to become more desirable to your woman men's group.
Yeah.
Um, Super excited. I have lots and lots of curriculum that is super tangible and digestible and also action oriented, and they can bring their partner along with them. So it
I
also
love.
includes external transformation. So we have a wardrobe consultant on staff, and she helps men like go through their closet and find outfits that will help them to feel more confident in just expressing themselves on dates or just in the presence of their magical queen. So
Yeah.
all
Beautiful.
for empowering men.
I love that. And do you work primarily with men in relationship or is it single men?
Yeah, primarily in men or men seeking a relationship, but within
Okay.
the dynamic
Yeah.
of
Committed
relationship.
relationship. Got it. No, it's beautiful. And then, yeah, how can they reach out? Like, where do they find you?
My Instagram is just cat_intimacy therapist, or I have a website. It's intimacyacademy.org.
Perfect. And we will link it up in the show notes so everybody can get access to you. And if you guys are looking for more intimacy, reach out to Kat. That's the word of advice.
Thanks, Dave.
You are so welcome. You and I can chat, more as we sign off here. Sorry. All right, guys. We'll see you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Unbreakable Man podcast. If you found this episode valuable, then go ahead and leave a 5-star review explaining how this podcast has helped you so more people can find it. If you want to be a part of the Brotherhood, then click the link in the description below. You can also check out the Unbreakable Man experience if you're ready to face a deeper challenge and change your life for the better in just 3 days. All right, guys. Thanks again for listening. I appreciate you. And as always, stay unbreakable.